Good day, GE with the word here. My last message was from Galatians chapter 6, verse 1, and it was one of our duties as Christians to help our struggling and failing brethren. I want to continue in this message with the duties of a Christian, speaking specifically about our duty to bear the burdens of others. Let me begin by reading Galatians chapter 6, verses 2 through 5. It reads this way: Bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if a man think himself to be something, when he is nothing, he deceiveth himself. But let every man prove his own work, and then shall he have rejoicing in himself alone, and not in another. For every man shall bear his own burden. Now, in these verses, we find our next duty, and that is to bear one another's burdens. In verse 2, we find a command from God to those who can assist others. Let me read that verse. Bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. Now, in order to bear one another's burdens, we've got to do more than just say, I'm sorry for you. We must have something called empathy. Now, there's a great difference in pity and sympathy and empathy. Pity is something that is impersonal, and it's pretty much useless for others and for you. Sympathy is feeling compassion, sadness, or sorrow for another. There's nothing wrong with that. But empathy is something that goes much deeper. It's a much deeper emotion wherein we actually enter into another's difficulties, whether it be physically or emotionally, and it often results in action. Now, that action may manifest itself in many, many ways. It may manifest itself in money or counseling, a gift or food or a phone call. A card might manifest itself in visiting a hospital or a nursing home or something of the nature. It might be something as simple as a hug or a handshake. And sometimes it might be as simple as a look. In verse 3, we find a caution from God to both those in need and to those assisting. Let me read verse 3. For if a man think himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceiveth himself. Now, this is a message to those in need of aid, and it tells us that no one is too good, nor too bad, nor too independent to not need help at one time or another. We all need someone sometime. Don't be too proud. Don't be too ashamed to receive help and someone to help you bear your burden. It's also a message, a caution from God to those giving aid. You're not too great, you're not too lowly to help or to bear the burden of your fellow human beings. How you help and what you do doesn't have to necessarily be some huge act. It could be, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that. And sometimes the smallest things can mean the most. Now, in verses 4 and 5, we find something interesting. We find a challenge from God to all of us. And first of all, it challenges us. We're challenged to grow. Christians are challenged to grow. Let me read verse 4. But let every man prove his own work, and then he shall have rejoicing in himself alone and not in another. And what this tells me is that we as Christians have the responsibility to grow so we will not have to be helped all the time in everything. And then secondly, it tells us we are challenged to be responsible for ourselves. This is talking to those who are receiving assistance. It challenges us to examine two verses together, actually. Now, in verse 5, we just read, for every man shall bear his own burden. But if you'll remember back in verse 2, we read, bear ye one another's burdens. Now, how do we reconcile those two verses? I've heard all kinds of explanations. I've heard people say that, the Bible contradicts itself. Well, the Bible does not contradict itself. So how do we reconcile these two verses? I think it's very simple. Those of us, when it says, bear ye one another's burdens, I think it says to those of us who are put in a position of knowledge of another person's difficulties and are able to assist, We are commanded by God to assist, bear ye one another's burdens. However, all of us are ultimately responsible for our own actions, our own responses, our own efforts, and our own decisions. For every man shall bear his own burden. My brethren, we as Christians have a duty to bear the burdens of others. We are commanded by God to do so. We are cautioned, both those in need and those who aid, to not regard ourselves as either too good or too bad or too high or too lowly. And we are challenged to grow in our spiritual lives in order to be able to help and to be responsible for our own things in our lives, difficulties. May God bless you this day and in the days to come.